Welcome, everybody. This is Across the Atlantic. We provide actionable insight at the intersection of geopolitics and capital markets. Today, I'm joined by Dr. John Ormerod. Dr. Ormerod is a renowned authority and globally recognized expert in the field of magnetics. He has authored numerous groundbreaking publications and is a frequent speaker at leading industry conferences. His deep understanding of rare earth magnet technology and the broader magnetics industry makes him an invaluable asset to clients seeking innovative solutions and strategic advantages. Dr. Ormerod graduated from the University of Manchester, UK Metals, with a BSc, MSc, and PhD in Metallurgy in 1975, 76, and 78, respectively. He has over 40 years of research, product development, and manufacturing experience in the area of soft and permanent magnets, as well as magnetic materials. He has published and presented numerous papers in the field of magnetic materials as well. He has spent time in Europe working for Phillips and in the USA working for SPS Technologies, formerly Arnold Engineering, and their magnetic materials businesses. In 2002, John was named president of Res Manufacturing in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Res is a manufacturer of stamped metal components, assemblies, and value-added services, servicing diversified industries. They are a major supplier of components and assemblies to Tesla Motors for their Model S and future Model X electric vehicle platforms. In 2015, John founded JOC LLC, consultancy specializing in the magnetics and metals-related industries. Clients here include IP law firms, major magnet manufacturers, magnetic equipment manufacturers, medical device R&D companies, motor manufacturers, Tier 1 automotive suppliers, and new magnetic material R&D businesses. He also recently co-authored the book titled Modern Permanent Magnets, that gives an overview of the key advances of permanent magnet materials that have occurred in the last 20 years. Dr. John Ormerod, thank you so much for hopping on. Manufacturer is a really hard word to say, I guess. Thank you so much for being with me this morning.
Hi, Garrett. Thanks for that kind introduction. Let me just say a little bit more about who I am.
Please.
I mean, I was born and raised in the northwest of England, in the industrial town of Blackburn, in the county of Lancashire, which, interestingly, is located in the region where the Industrial Revolution began. I was the first in my family to attend university, and as you said, I studied metallurgy at the University of Manchester. And yes, my team is Manchester United. I mean, I guess one recurrent theme or thread in my story, my career, my life is I've had the good fortune of having some amazing teachers and mentors. Also, as you said, I earned my PhD in 78. I did 1 year's postdoc in nuclear engineering, but then decided to try my hand in the real world. I joined Phillips Electronics in their magnetic materials factory in Southport, which is actually near Liverpool, and my team is not Liverpool. My first job was as a development engineer, assigned to develop and set up manufacturing of the first generation of rare earth magnets based on the alloy of samarium and cobalt. I also, at this time, spent around 3 years at the Phillips Central Research Labs based in Holland. And this was really my first introduction to magnets and magnetics. And again, I mean, I had the great fortune to be in the presence of some incredible experts in the field who fortunately took the time to mentor me. And I got to say, I'm forever in their debt. In the 80s, early 80s, Phillips built a sintered neodymium iron boron magnet plant in Southport, which was actually one of the first in Europe, and we became a major supplier of voice coil motor assemblies for the disk drive industry. Then in 90, I was tempted by the law of the US, and I joined Arnold Magnetics, eventually running their permanent magnet businesses. Again, incredible learning experience. 2002, I became president of an automotive component and assembly business in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then things took a turn in late either April or early May 2013. My wife and I are sitting in Wisconsin, in our house in Wisconsin. Snow is falling. It's negative wind chills. And I think both my wife and I looked at each other and said, we're not doing another Midwest winter. So
Understandably.
he looked around and ended up relocating to this beautiful part of the country in East Tennessee, just outside Knoxville. And that's what that really was the kernel of me starting this consulting business that I've been doing for the last 10 or 11 years, where I've been attempting to help clients, navigate the complexities of the rare earth magnet supply chain. So that's a little bit more about me. I hope that wasn't too boring.
No, 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 not at all. In fact, a lot. So very much appreciate it. Very much appreciate it. Now, again, Dr. John Ormerod, given your background here, and again, breadth of experience in the space, which is, as we said, vast. Starting with the basics, and I think this is going to be helpful for a lot of folks, myself included in this. The distinction between rare earth magnets, rare earths, permanent magnets, all this kind of stuff. If you could give a brief history of what a permanent magnet is, uh, a brief history of that, rare earth magnets, and your involvement with the entire space.
Okay, so permanent magnets. So it's kind of interesting. In the last, I think it's last couple of weeks, I received quite a few emails and voicemails and phone calls from friends and neighbors telling me that President Trump was reported as saying, and this might not be the exact quote, but nobody understands magnets. So, I got to politely beg to differ about that comment, because I know, and I'm not talking about myself, but I know a bunch of really smart people out there who understand everything there is to know about permanent magnets. But I do want to say that the subject of magnetism, a little bit like gravity, is kind of still a mystery. Sure, we understand the origins of magnetism. We can model how it behaves and how it interacts with other materials. But maybe I should speak for myself. I'm not sure I really understand the magic of magnetism. But let's talk about permanent magnets, which we really, really do understand. Um, I've often used this phrase, hidden but essential. And what I'm trying to say is, magnets are buried in numerous devices. We use them every moment of the day, literally. And but very few people realize that magnets even exist in these devices, and more importantly, the critical function that they perform. So, what is a permanent magnet? It's a material that becomes magnetized when it's exposed to an external magnetic field, typically from an electromagnet. Now, there are lots of magnetic materials like iron, steel, cobalt, nickel. The difference with a permanent magnet is it retains its magnetization even when that external field is removed. Those other materials, they don't retain the magnetization. They're so-called soft magnetic materials. A permanent magnet is also known as a hard magnetic material. So they retain magnetization, but even more importantly, is a key characteristic is their ability to maintain that magnetization even under very high demagnetizing fields. And these are the types of situations that occur in applications such as high performance electric motors, actuators, generators, and so on. Permanent magnets are everywhere in modern technology. We see them in transportation, industrial systems, consumer electronics, wind energy generation, medical devices, aerospace, and of course, many, many applications in the defense world. I get when you boil it down, I think the core function of a permanent magnet is to generate a contactless force, either attraction, repulsion, or an interaction with an electric current or a charged particle. Um, the defining advantage of a permanent magnet is its ability to provide a constant magnetic field without any energy input. So it's got zero operating cost, which is why when you talk about permanent magnet motors, for example, they are more efficient than their non-permanent magnet machines, so-called induction motors. Now, electromagnets require an electrical current to function. So they require a constant supply of energy in the terms of an electrical current to produce a field. A permanent magnet is a passive, efficient generation of magnetic flux, and that really underpins I think, their widespread technological importance. I think there's five commercially significant permanent magnet materials: hard ferrite or ceramic, alnico, bonded neodymium-ion boron, samarium cobalt, and sintered neodymium-ion boron. And these materials are distinguished by but basically their potential magnetic energy per unit volume. And that's, in the industry, we call that the maximum energy product, or BHmax. Ferrite has the lowest value. Neodymium-ion boron has the highest, at roughly 10 or 12 times higher than ferrite. Just a little bit about samarium cobalt magnets, because they're interesting, because they were the first generation of rare earth magnets, and they actually originated here in the US from research at the University of Dayton and the US Air Force R&D labs in the late 60s, early 70s. Then what happened during the mid 70s, there were some major disruptions in the supply of cobalt due to turmoil in Zaire, which I think is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what happened, magnetic materials research shifted towards iron-based, away from cobalt-based magnets, to iron-based rare earth compositions, particularly compounds using the more plentiful rare earth elements. And that culminated in the simultaneous discovery, which is an interesting story. We don't have time to go in detail, but it's a simultaneous discovery of neodymium-ion boron in 1983 by both General Motors here in the US and Sumitomo Special Metals of Japan. Just to finish this piece on magnets, I mean, there's two materials that dominate the permanent magnet market today. One is hard ferrite magnets, or they're also referred to as ceramic magnets, and neodymium-ion boron. I mean, those two material types account for probably at least 95% of the permanent magnet market by value.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. No, that's incredible. And I mean, look, if you want to, I know we talked about your background, John, but if you want to give your involvement in that space, a lot of technical pieces on there, and honestly, a lot of follow-on questions I'm probably going to email you about. I wish I could get into here. But I think, yeah, just giving your involvement in all of that would be helpful.
Sure. Well, maybe what I'd like to do is perhaps move on and just talk about, what are the critical. We talk about rare earths. I don't think I mentioned a particular element in that last section. So maybe I should talk about, what are the important rare earths as applied to permanent magnets, and what industries do they tend to be used in.
Yeah.
And that might bring out a little bit about my involvement. But let's just move. Let me talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
The performance of modern permanent magnets, I mean, are obviously dependent on the specific rare earth elements. The rare earth elements are broadly categorized into two groups: the light rare earth elements and the heavy rare earth elements. And that grouping is really just about their atomic numbers, but also their chemical similarities. But each type, light and heavy, plays a distinct role. The important light rare earth elements for permanent magnets are the two elements neodymium and praseodymium. And these are basically the fundamental building blocks of this most powerful class of permanent magnets based on the alloy neodymium iron boron. And it's, it's basically, they've got this unique electronic structure that creates incredibly powerful magnetic fields that can also resist demagnetization. Now, for applications where these magnets face higher operating temperatures, now, electric vehicle traction drive mode is one typical area. The heavy rare earth elements of dysprosium and terbium are essential alloying additions. These two heavy rare earth elements enhance the magnet's resistance to demagnetization, excuse me, at elevated temperatures and create essentially specialized high-grade magnets. We've also got to talk about samarium because that's obviously a key element in samarium cobalt magnets, which again were the first generation of high-performance rare earth magnets. But this class of magnet, although albeit it's a small piece of the total market, remain vital for defense and aerospace applications where you require exceptional thermal and corrosion stability. I'll talk a little bit about the minerals where these elements are derived from, because of course, the specific elements we talked about are not found in the pure form in nature, but they're extracted from minerals. Bastnäsite is the first one. It's a carbonate fluoride mineral. It's the predominant source of light rare earths. It's the primary mineral at the enormous Bayan Obo complex in Inner Mongolia and China, but also the type of mineral that's mined at the Mountain Pass mine here in the United States. The next is monazite. This is a phosphate mineral. Again, it's primarily light rare earths, but it also contains traces of radioactive thorium and uranium, which adds complexity to its processing due to, obviously that has to be separated out and stored. It's often found in heavy mineral sand deposits and actually contains small but economic levels of heavy rare earths often. The next one is, and this is pretty key, is this type of mineral called ion absorption clays. And these are found in subtropical regions of the world. And these clays are unique because the rare earth elements are loosely absorbed to the clay particles. It allows relatively simple, low-cost leaching extractions. They're found in southern China and Myanmar. And here's the important point. They're really the world's primary sources of heavy rare earths like dysprosium and terbium today. There's another mineral, zeolite. I won't get into detail there, but it does can contain significant heavy rare earths. Now, the real issue is the geographic distribution of these minerals obviously influences the global supply chain. Light rare earths are more widely available from multiple sources, while the production of heavy rare earths is heavily concentrated in the regions where I mentioned the ion absorption clay deposits are, which today is southern China and Myanmar. And that's probably the essence of the supply chain challenges and strategic considerations that we're currently experiencing.
Okay. That's interesting too, the geographic piece as well. The split, and this is a piece that frankly I didn't know either. John, was the split between light and the heavy. And so everything right now, it sounds like that's going on in the news. And this is like all the very top level stuff, all the technical pieces that we're getting into today and this morning is the suit, like that's the protein of it. That's the meat of everything. We very quickly understand why this is such an issue. And so it sounds like, and tell me where I'm wrong on this. We just riff, but so it sounds like right now in modern day technology and all the applications that it comes in, whether that's consumer or defense or medical or transportation, all, technology in those various brackets, it sounds like most of those are using the heavy component, the heavy, or drawing from that heavy bucket as opposed to the light bucket. Is that correct?
I think I would I think we're going to. I was going to talk about the export licensing requirements that China have implemented back in April,
Yeah.
and then they did something else in October. The focus there is on the heavy rare earths, dysprosium, terbium, and samarium, which it's no accident that those elements are required for the higher temperature, higher performance grades, which are typically, I mean, they're needed for commercial applications, but they're very much needed for defense applications. I think that's the crux, if you boil it all down, of what's going on. But let me just go on a little bit further about a little bit more maybe about this geographical
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
distribution and which are the most critical and where they are found and how they work in magnet compositions.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
So again, I'm finding I think I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but
No,
the
please.
rare
It's
earth
all good.
elements distributed, on a global sense, but the extraction and processing is dominated by China, which also holds the world's largest reserves of rare earth elements, and it's the top producer. I mean, the dominance is anchored by this major deposit at the in Inner Mongolia, the Bayon Obo mining complex, which actually is an iron ore mine, and a co-product is the rare earth deposit. Now, that's not to say there are other nations that have significant reserves, and there's, notable deposits in places like Vietnam, Brazil, Australia, of course, Russia, India, and let's not forget the United States, which is the home to this Mountain Pass mine in California, which is, again, this bastnäsite deposit, which is heavily light rare earths, so primarily neodymium and praseodymium are the elements for rare earth magnets. I mean, arguably, the critical issue for the global permanent magnet industry is not a general shortage of rare earths, but it's this severe concentration of the heavies, specifically dysprosium and terbium. Because again, these elements are what are required or what are essential for manufacturing high temperature, high performance magnets used in electric vehicles, advanced defense systems,
Right.
high power motors for industrial automation, robotics, etc. China's got this near monopoly on the production of heavy rare earth, and it stems from its control over these iron absorption clay deposits, not only in the south of China, but Miramar, which is really controlled by China.
Right.
So, to mitigate this vulnerability, which is a strategic vulnerability, we have to build a more resilient supply chain. There are several, non-Chinese companies who are making progress. Lynas Rare Earths in Australia, and their separation plant in Malaysia, is currently probably the largest producer outside of China of separated heavy rare earth oxides. There's also Energy Fuels here in the US that's developing a heavy mineral sands pipeline from the American Southwest. And then, of course, MP Materials, which is the operator of Mountain Pass, has announced plans to expand beyond their light rare earth into the separation and processing of heavies. I mean, I guess the industry's focus is on developing not just alternative sources of rare earths, but establishing secure, independent, commercially viable production streams for these, particularly for the critical heavy rare earths of dysprosium and terbium.
Yeah. And I think commercially viable is the piece that I would draw out there too. And I think it gets into the, as the next piece that we're going to talk about, John, is um, designing and balancing cost, materials, performance, and as you had mentioned, and as we're talking about, the supply chain risk, which is very interesting, particularly when we're talking about China and its current underscored current dominance of that supply chain. Now,
Sure.
if you could, before we do get into, John, how you think about balancing material cost, performance, and supply chain risk, can you explain a little bit? This is for my own benefit. Can you explain a little bit what that supply chain looks like? Because, when I look on Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal or whatever article or publication I'm reading at the time, the conversation usually stops at just supply chain, but not a lot of people know exactly what that is, particularly folks that are not in the metals and mining space. So this starts with, yes, you bring X thing out of the ground. You then have to produce that thing out of the ground, and then the supply chain goes on and on and on. But if you can explain a little bit of those steps and how it actually goes from in the ground to consumer product, like end user product, I think that would be helpful for a lot of people to just visualize and think about it.
Okay. Well, I'm going to use MP materials as the example. Um, so the Mountain Pass mine, it's bastnäsite deposit in California. The material is dug out of the ground. It then goes through let me call it a concentration step, where essentially you want to remove all the rock and just treat the mineral itself. And this is usually some sort of froth flotation or other process, but it's concentration to get to the mineral itself. That mineral then goes through a series of chemical processes and thermal processes typically to produce a mixed carbonate of the rare earth elements, or sorry, the rare earth compounds, in this case, carbonates. That then goes through this process where you've got to separate, you need to separate the individual rare earth elements. And okay, that sounds simple, but it's very difficult because chemically, the rare earth elements are very, very similar. So it's difficult to separate them as individual elements or compounds. So this is done through this thing called solvent extraction, which again is done by MP Materials at their Mountain Pass mine. So you end up with a separated collection of rare earth compounds. The next critical step is you've got to convert those compounds to metal. So you've got to take, let's say, neodymium or praseodymium oxide and convert it to a metal. The rare earth elements are really incredibly reactive, which means it's very difficult to break down from the oxide to the metal. And the typical processes that you use are electrochemical process is somewhat similar to the way aluminum is made from bauxite. But that electrical chemical process produces pure metal of neodymium or praseodymium or even a mixture. So we've got the basic metal now. The next step is we need to alloy it, produce the composition that ends up as the the optimum composition for the magnet grade we're producing. So we're going to vacuum melt neodymium, praseodymium, usually ferroboron, iron, and some other minor elements in a vacuum furnace. Melt it, and then it's poured as a molten alloy onto a rotating, typically copper wheel, where we essentially quench rapidly the molten alloy to a solid flake material. So we have a flake now of, it's maybe, I don't know, an inch by a quarter an inch, something like that, kind of dimension wise. Those flakes are then, believe it or not, are subject to a hydrogen gas treatment that breaks down the breaks down these flakes into a coarse, brittle powder. That coarse, brittle powder is fed into a thing called a jet mill that then produces a very, very fine powder with a very narrow particle size distribution of around 5 microns. That powder is then taken to a press, hydraulic or a servo press, where you press in a die under the action of a magnetic field. So each of those little powder particles are oriented in one direction. You compact it to a what's called a green compact. That green compact is then transferred to a vacuum sintering furnace. It's sintered to full density at around 1100 degrees centigrade. It's heat treated to optimize the properties. They're then machined to basically to the finished magnet dimension and shapes that you require. They're typically coated either with a copper nickel plate or an epoxy type coating. Then they're magnetized and then shipped to the customer, the motor manufacturer, the loudspeaker manufacturer, the actuator manufacturer. That roughly is how these things are made. And as I was saying it, I realized there's a lot of steps in this process. But,
Just a few, right?
So maybe that's the point.
Yeah, yeah, no, and look, that's helpful. Again, I think a lot of folks, they just see supply chain and they again, the conversation ends there. There's no real understanding of what that actually entails. And to go on to our next piece here, John, and they don't understand why China's announcement, as you mentioned, in April and then again in October of these rare earth export controls to the United States, why they were such a big deal. And as you discussed and as you mentioned, currently, of those processes that you had just mentioned from extraction and then on, China controls a lot of those steps, it sounds like, and how they arrive to the end consumer, so U.S. industries. And of course, we've already rattled those off, but national defense is, I think, key of mind, especially when you see a lot in the news and the U.S. government is very involved. That kind of answers the question of why do we care so much, right?
Yeah.
But if you could explain or help us explain of those steps that you just mentioned, just lay it out clearly, which do China currently control? And again, this is all within the context of they operate in that heavy bucket. But which of those steps do China currently control? And then why? We talked a little bit about this, but why were those export controls in April and then October such a big deal? As we sit here in December, I think the current administration in China have reached some sort of deal. It was only about 365 days, if I remember correctly. So we've suspended that for 365 days. I think this is a bit of a tangent for me. China's pretty infamous for not upholding their end of the bargain. So we'll even see if the current suspension of export controls remains in place for the next year. But I digress. John, if you could just run through which portions of those supply chain steps China currently controls and why those announcement of export controls to the U.S. were a big deal.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm going to state the obvious. No doubt that these export controls on rare earths or critical, materials. I mean, they are a significant, I guess, geopolitical and economic event because China doesn't just mine rare earths; it dominates the entire global supply chain, from raw material to finished high-value components. So they have a strong strategic lever here. China refines, I don't know, 80 to 90% of the world's rare earths, including, as we've already said, almost 100% of all the heavies, so dysprosium and terbium. And it's actually interesting. Some minerals mined in other countries are often shipped to China for separation and refining. So, it's this monopoly on the midstream processing that really is the critical choke point. As there's very few nations possess the complex, environmentally challenging industrial capability to do it at the scale that China is doing. Again, I mean, I'm just going to repeat myself, but the elements that are important are really dysprosium and terbium, which are needed for high temperature performance in, motors, electric vehicles, defense system. And China controls 95% of the supply of those materials. It also produces between 85% plus of the world's rare earth permanent magnets. So even if the raw materials are sourced elsewhere, um, the final value-added component manufacturing is overwhelmingly concentrated in China. So it makes entire industries, automotive, EVs, robotics, defense, aerospace, wind turbines, dependent on the industrial output of China today. Just talking about the export licensing, though, I mean, their announcement back in April kind of frames the controls under this long-standing dual use regulation, which has been around for years. And it means that materials that can be dual use means materials that can be used for both civilian slash commercial and military purposes. And their justification is they're using the rationale of security concerns, domestic, well, international security concerns, I guess, that grants the Chinese government broad discretionary power over the global technology flows. So the existing April regulations from the Ministry of Commerce, in Chinese Ministry of Commerce, is, at least for permanent magnets, just talking about permanent magnets, it's specific export licenses for the metals, the materials that contain them of dysprosium, terbium, and samarium. And this has already created a logjam in terms of magnetic exports. It's there's a big bureaucratic delay. There's uncertainty for buyers, increased transaction costs. I mean, it's effectively kind of a soft quota, or has been, or even a tax, because there's additional cost to get these things out and testing and all sorts of things. Now, as you mentioned, Garrett, there has been some recent easing announced in, I guess it was November, in terms of pausing the latest regulations for 1 year and introducing this general license program. Now, it appears these general licenses have helped to clear some of the export backlogs, but it doesn't remove the basic control mechanism. The process is still conditional. There's still a requirement for evidence that the magnets will not be used in military systems, or defense systems, let's call it that. It's kind of forcing, companies and governments to disclose potentially sensitive supply chain details and details on the end use applications to the Chinese authority. So not only is there a significant compliance burden, but it's another potential leverage point in these geopolitical negotiations. I mean, the announcements are a big deal because I guess it weaponizes China's supply chain dominance, and it's not a blanket ban. They're not saying all rare earths or we're not going to export, because interestingly, neodymium and praseodymium are not affected at all. So it's kind of almost a calibrated tool that's could slow down high-tech manufacturing because of the administration, I don't know, friction, for the want of a better word. It increases the cost. It allows the Chinese to gather intelligence on, the defense and technology supply chains through this end-use certifications. And again, it's showing that China's willingness to use this resource dominance as a strategic negotiation point. Again, the threat is not sudden cut-off of supply, but it's this risk of managed scarcity and delayed shipments and the leverage gained by holding, input for the global energy transition and modern defense systems.
100%. And there's a few pieces in there that I think dovetail nicely, John, with our next piece as well. And look, we're talking a lot about what the actual issue is, which is super helpful. It's not a blanket ban. It's just limiting certain factors on how folks here sitting in the U.S. are able to acquire and attain to then get to their own end product, whatever industry that they sit in. Now, look, we talk a lot about companies, and as a country, I think, and just the collective West as well, reshoring, friendshoring, all sorts of different industries and supply chains. Undoubtedly, the ones that we're talking about today are part of that conversation. So the permanent magnets and rare earth materials and minerals, these are all, of course, part and parcel of the conversation of friendshoring and reshoring. Rather, I'll put it magnetization, domestication. So we're coming back to onshoring magnet supply, which is again what we're already talking about. Which of course is of the key player in mind here is to reduce reliance on Chinese supply, of which we've established they control a lot of that supply chain from extraction and then on. And this is why, John, it's really good to have you on from a technical readiness perspective. What parts of that supply chain, from mining, separation, alloying, magnet shaping and coating, the list goes on, but of that supply chain, which parts are easiest to bring back to the US? Or you could just even say the collective West. You mentioned Australia and some other countries, I'm sure, are probably top of mind for you. Which parts of that supply chain are easiest to reshore here to the US? Which remain the most difficult to take away from China, or just any other parts which remain the hardest to bring back to US shores? And this is all with the mindset, I think, of a lot of the folks that watch this show, right? So investors, corporates, maybe even board members as well, and how they think about this too. And before you answer, I guess I'll just give the context of it. I guess the piece we haven't said out loud is that we operate in two different systems, right? So the Chinese, and this is going to be super high level, but the Chinese system is inherently state driven. So they can throw money and they can produce oversupply of all of these components and commodities at a loss, and that's fine. But in our capitalist driven system, investors need to see a return, and a lot of the times, getting these projects and assets up and running and actually producing, one, takes a lot of money, and two, takes a lot of time, which balancing these two systems in the context of our conversation on supply chain is really important to note. So that is the context. Which parts remain, John, in your eyes, from a technical readiness perspective, the easiest to bring back to the shores of the US and the West? Which remain the hardest?
Okay. So magnetization, domestication, that's easy for you to say. I mean, I'd never heard that term before, but
Yeah.
I'll run with that. I guess, the narrative around, and I'm going to speak from both sides of my mouth, I realize as I'm going to say this, but the narrative around building a non-Chinese permanent magnet supply chain, and it's focusing on securing raw materials, the critical raw materials of basically dysprosium and terbium, and the processes to refine and metallize and so on. Now, yeah, those are incredibly critical. But I think what we're overlooking, something what I consider is really the more fundamental bottleneck in terms of whatever you want to call it, reshoring. Um, you got to remember that the industry, we allowed the industry, and I'm talking about the US, but probably Europe as well, to shut down, um, almost 30 years ago. So developing that, relearning, developing the manufacturing technology excellence and the know-how to consistently produce high performance magnets at high volume with high yields, high productivity, and high quality. That's the challenge. Now, I did a recent LinkedIn post, and I used this term hardware and software. The hardware for neodymium iron boron magnet production, so the strip casters, the jet mills, the presses, sintering furnaces, magnetizers, are actually all commercially available from global suppliers. You don't have to go to China for that hardware, that equipment. So, okay, it does require a considerable capital, but if you have the capital, the procuring and installation of that equipment is a relatively straightforward engineering task. You can bolt the equipment down and connect it up to the utilities and so on. The challenge is transforming that collection of machines into a reliable high volume production facility.
Right.
That's an entirely different challenge. That's the software problem, as I've called it. And I'm not using software in the computer digital sense, but I was really trying to use it in terms of the human capital that's required. The intellect, the ingenuity, the deep-seated expertise that forms this, I don't know, connective tissue between the machines that creates this efficient production system. It's that know-how that's going to, excuse me, dictate the quality, the yield, and the scale of the operation. This software or human capital, I mean, it's really a diverse team of specialized talent. So we need metallurgists, material scientists who can master the alloy and the magnet microstructure, process manufacturing tooling engineers to optimize every step from the powder to the finished magnet, control automation, electrical engineers, ensuring precision, repeatability. We need magnetics engineers for performance specs, quality and maintenance techs to uphold standards and uptime, and so on. And the technicians who actually run the equipment and the process. My point is, this is what I think is really more scarce and more critical resource in any single year. That's the challenge, the major challenge we have in let me just say the US. I mean, just give you some context. We had 3 commercial sintered neodymium ion boron manufacturers in the US in the early 2000s. Between them, cumulatively, they produced less than 1,000 tons of magnets per year. Now we're talking about individual factories and facilities that are going to be producing multiples of those volumes. I mean, the challenge is not just making a few hundred kilograms of magnets, but it's to do it at scale, with consistency and cost that can compete globally. So we have a steep learning curve. I mean, I think the gap can be closed through focused investment in the HR side of this, and smart experimentation, advanced process modeling, maybe the use of AI for material and parameter optimization will help us get up that learning curve faster. But what I would say, the one little piece of advice I would give is if you're looking at a partnership or an investment in a non-Chinese neodymium ion boron producer, spend a little time looking at the equipment, the hardware piece. I would invest most of the diligence in understanding the organization, the depth of expertise,
the software side of that, right?
Yeah, the software, the cohesion of talent, the quality of leadership, culture of improvement. I think that's what's going to separate the leaders from the also-rans.
That's super helpful. And I like the way that you think about that too. So the hardware breakout, it's like, hey, yeah, we can get the equipment from anywhere. There's plenty of companies around the globe that produce and make the equipment that we need to actually begin the process. Now, the know-how, the technical piece, the actual people of it, the software. I really like that breakout. I think it's helpful to think about it in a I think classically challenging, technically challenging industry. So that's great. So keeping us moving on here, John, looking ahead, and I'm sure you think about this a lot, of course, this is your bread and butter. So looking ahead to the next generation of magnet applications, things like high-speed motors, compact aerospace actuators, quantum, sensor magnets, the list goes on. What technical breakthroughs 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever, just in the future, what technical breakthroughs or supply chain innovations? And I think you started to mention some of these in the last piece of how we might be able to break that supply chain domination and pivot it towards, the West and just more westward in general. But thinking to the future, what technical breakthroughs or supply chain innovations would cause or raise a green or red flag from an investment perspective in your mind? When you're going to bed at night or getting ready in the morning, what are you thinking about? Like, hey, that would be really, really exciting to see if somebody was able to do this thing, or hey, this would be really, really bad if Russia or China was able to figure this out, in the future, things like this.
Sure. I mean, yeah, obviously I do give this a lot of thought. And I got to tell you, it's difficult for me to envision a scenario where neodymium ion boron magnets are going to lose significant market share to a new material entrant. And I'm going to use some weasel words here, but in the foreseeable future.
A
So
true consultant. I like it.
it's just difficult. I mean, the market structure that Neo has developed, along with hard ferrite, it's really highly resistant to disruption. Why? Well, there's a low performance segment of magnets, neodymium ion boron magnets, that are dominated already by cost optimized materials. We've already seen the substitution of neodymium with low cost cerium that are used in many lower grade commercial neodymium ion boron magnets. And this, it's really effectively commoditized the low end of the magnet range. And, it's incredibly formidable price barriers to any new competitor. Now, for applications requiring higher maximum energy density, again, we'll talk about electric vehicle traction drives, advanced robotics. The performance gap between high-grade neodymium ion boron and any alternative that I'm aware of is vast. Any new material would have to be revolutionary in terms of its strength or cost effectiveness, I think, to displace neodymium ion boron's entrenched position. Now, having said what I just said, I mean, of course, some novel magnet material might emerge, but I think it's going to have some, very specific niche application. So for extreme environments where temperature stability is paramount, I just don't see a broad-based market shifting displacement happening. Given the current technological and economic realities. I mean, I just want to point something out. The permanent magnet market, I think I said earlier on, is dominated by two material types: hard ferrite and neodymium ion boron. And I actually look back at some numbers that from 1994, where I estimated the market compared 30 years later to today. And what you see is the neodymium ion boron market has gone from about 800 million in 94 to over 15 billion last year.
Wow.
Hard ferrite has gone from 1.9 billion to 8.4 billion. I mean, it's just got an unbeatable cost of performance in lots of applications. All the other magnet types, iron, nickel, samarium, cobalt, their share has gone from 15% decline to 3%. So you've got this duopoly of these two materials at really two ends of the performance spectrum, that because of their price performance ratios, they dominate the industry by value.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. And, look, I think it's probably, and you know this obviously better than myself, but I think it's probably a really hard space to find those kind of innovations that you're describing, right? Um, and the benchmark that a lot of people put on or think about when they think about innovation and the rate of technological, improvement and how processes change, they always look to the tech sector, right? And say, well, hey, look, we're seeing this increasingly fast rate of process improvement, et cetera, et cetera. How we do things is improving, maybe becoming more efficient, whatever it may be. But in my mind, it's just such a hard, I mean, you cannot equate that rate of change and processes to the space that we're talking about. So metals and mining. Now tell me if I'm off on that. That's just my initial thought. I think it's kind of helpful because that's probably how I imagine a lot of people think about it. Would be interesting to hear your thoughts, John.
Well, there's an old term that
Kind of entrenched process.
that comes from the my time in the UK. It's It's like chalk and cheese. They're both white, but they taste very different. There's really
That's
no
true.
comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So bringing us, John, to our last piece, and I am looking at the clock. It is, want to be respectful of your time here, of course. A lot of what we're talking about is very meaty, very chunky. So I appreciate that. We want to give it its due time in the light and due time to shine. So, John, for many companies positioned as part of this entire conversation that we've been having, um, the magnet and rare earth ecosystem, both globally as a part of China, but then, of course, thinking more locally to where we both sit here in the US and how we're rebuilding a lot of these production capacities and supply chain capacities here back in the United States. For companies positioned as at any part of the supply chain, if you were to role play here as a board member on private companies, public companies that are involved in these processes and supply chains today, what would be one technical KPI? And you're the person to answer this. I would underscore and bold the technical KPI. But what would be one of those technical KPIs that you would insist be a part of your investor deck? And one that you would be most interested in seeing would need to be seen as a part of this whole ecosystem of supply chain.
Okay. Um, all right. Well, I mean, the establishment of a domestic, I'm just talking about the US
Yep.
domestic supply chain. I mean, I think there's some tangible progress being made. I mean, I see by the end of 2026, or at least sometime in 26, we can we can realistically expect there's going to be three significant US based manufacturers. So Novion, MP Materials, and Vacuum Smelter through their EVAC facility. I think those are going to all of those are going to reach meaningful commercial production of sintered neodymium ion boron magnets next year. Now, interestingly, I just saw in the last few days on LinkedIn, Vacuum Smelter have announced the start of and they called it industrial production at their South Carolina EVAC facility, which I got to tell you, I find incredible because they only broke ground 20 months ago, roughly 20 months ago. And now they're saying they're in industrial production of these magnets. That's phenomenal. But having said that, I mean, so I could see that in the US we could have, 3,000 metric tons of capacity online sometime next year, which is an amazing first step. We still have the issue of the heavy rare earth supply, but we've kind of hammered that to death. KPIs, I'm not sure. Okay. A while ago, I proposed this thing I call probability of commercial success, and that really relates to the material.
Right.
But it's made up of these different factors. And just quickly, and if anybody's interested, I can send them the detail. But the first thing I would look at is I've called it the magnetic health check. And I hate to get in the weeds here, but it's the ratio of coercivity to remnants, which should be close to 1. Because if you look at those two materials that dominate the market, they have ratios very close to 1. All the others don't. So that's the first one. Then there's got to be an economic gatekeeper, which is this price performance index, cost per unit volume against the magnetic performance of the material. Energy product itself is important. Maximum operating temperature is important. Recyclability and supply chain security is important. When you put all those values into this formula, I mean, what I found is that the two materials, hard ferrite and neodymium ion boron, have values significantly above 100. Everything else is less than 100. So I would say if you're developing a new magnet material, I think this probability of commercial success index should be greater than 100. But again, I can share the details with anybody who's interested. Now, I also did another thing, which I'm not sure it's a KPI, but I called it probability of business success. And honestly, when I did this, it was kind of tongue in cheek.
I like
But
it.
the more I
It's
thought
good.
about it, the more I'm kind of thinking, okay, maybe this is okay. So the first one is a build to scale ratio. And all you do is you look at the organization chart. Okay, I remind you, it's tongue in cheek. And you look at the ratio of process, manufacturing, tooling type engineers to the PhDs in R&D, and that should exceed 5. Because what that I'm saying is that you need to prioritize getting to scalable production over perpetual experimentation.
Yeah.
And I can say that because I am a PhD.
Yeah.
The other one is, again, I remember it's tongue in cheek, substance over hype ratio. This one, you go to the P&L or the budget, and you
Right.
look at the ratio of engineering and technology expense to marketing spend, and that should exceed 10. Because, uh, and I cast my mind back to 1983. Sumitomo Special Metals announced neodymium iron boron magnets, neodymium iron boron as a material. I don't remember seeing one piece of marketing because, if it's a truly groundbreaking material, the performance is going to drive the adoption.
Right.
And we almost argue that excessive early marketing, you know, almost signals a lack of fundamental commercial strength. So that's why I have that. But those are, again, bit tongue in cheek, but
No, you know why
those
those are great? I think, and again, for a lot of the folks that are going to be listening to this, is that it makes it understandable and it makes it digestible. So I love those quotes. So I love the tongue in cheek. It's great. And especially for decision makers too. Like a lot of this has to be high level anyway. So that makes a lot of sense. And I think it harkens back to John, some of your points that you were making earlier of like, especially on the first example you gave has to focus in on the software components of this. So the technical know-how that you have in-house working at, again, could be public company, could be private company, but the certain ratios of, where are we spending our time as a company and where are we spending our money as a company? I think you could sum it up to those two things. Um, of course, being very aptly said for the industry, but that's how I would sum up those two examples you just gave. So very helpful. Appreciate it. Now, looking at the clock, this has been an awesome, all-encompassing conversation, John. So very much appreciate the time. I want to give you a spotlight and a blowhorn here to shout of everything you're working on. So, John, where can folks find you? What are you working on, and what is new with Dr. John Ormerod?
um, well, let me frame it this way. So over Thanksgiving,
Yeah,
we were blessed with the arrival of our seventh grandchild.
congrats,
So
congratulations.
my number one priority is spending time with my grandkids. Number two
That's a big new thing.
is,
Yeah, I like it.
yeah, um, just enjoying life and with my wife, and I'm supposed to be retired. And I don't know if I should say this, but a rather distant number three is keeping my brain in some sort of shape by dabbling in rare earth magnet consulting, at least as long as somebody thinks I can bring some value to their organization, or just help them navigate the complexities of this, the supply chain. If you want to find me, LinkedIn's a good place, and I have this really poor website, JOC LLC. But if you're interested, you can find me on those places.
Excellent. And John, we'll also link everything below too. So the LinkedIn, your consulting website, white papers, everything else. We'll put it. So please, everybody, go check those out in the description below. It's going to be fantastic. Dr. John Ormerod, thank you so much for your time. An honest pleasure to have you here, my friend. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks, Garrett.